January 30th, 1968. Fubai Combat Base, 12 kilometers south of Hue City, Toi Tien Province. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, the kind that makes you question whether your eyes are open or closed, when the first explosion shattered the night. Not the distant rumble of artillery, but the sharp crack of rockets impacting on our positions, announcing that the war had changed fundamentally. I was Corporal Jim Sullivan, rifleman with Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, 3rd Marine Division, 24 years old from Chicago, beginning a battle that would last 26 days and become the longest, bloodiest urban combat in American military history. Hue was different from other Vietnamese cities we'd operated in. It was the ancient imperial capital, cultural and spiritual heart of Vietnam, city of palaces and pagodas and history stretching back centuries. The Perfume River divided Hue into two sections. North of the river was the Citadel, 2.5 square kilometers of imperial buildings surrounded by walls 20 feet high and 20 feet thick, built in early 1800s by Emperor Ya Long. South of the river was the new city, the modern administrative and commercial district, where MACV compound was located. Hue exceeded 140,000, making it Vietnam's third largest city after Saigon and Da Nang. Unlike other cities that had experienced extensive combat, Hue had remained relatively peaceful. Both sides seemed to respect its cultural significance, conducting operations outside the city rather than fighting through streets and buildings that held such historical importance. That implicit understanding ended at 0340 hours on January 31st, 1968, when approximately 10,000 North Vietnamese Army soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas launched coordinated attacks throughout Hue as part of the Tet Offensive, the massive communist offensive targeting over 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive had begun the previous night with attacks throughout the country, catching American and South Vietnamese forces by surprise during Vietnam's most important holiday, when traditional ceasefire was in effect. Intelligence had warned of potential offensive, but the scale and coordination exceeded what anyone anticipated. For the first time, Communist forces were conducting conventional military operations in urban environments, trying to spark general uprising, attempting to demonstrate that American claims about progress were illusions. At Phu Bai, we'd been on alert since midnight. Intelligence reports suggested possible attacks. All units were at heightened readiness. When rockets began impacting at 0340 hours, we immediately manned fighting positions, expecting ground assault to follow preparatory bombardment. But the rockets stopped after 20 minutes. Damage was minimal. No ground attack materialized. Then, at 500 hours, radio calls started coming from Hue, fragmentary, confused, suggesting major enemy action in the city. The MACV compound south of river was under attack. South Vietnamese army positions in the Citadel were being overrun. Enemy forces were in the streets, occupying buildings, raising communist flags over government buildings. The reports were so unexpected, so contrary to everything we'd been told about Hue being secure, that initial reaction was disbelief. "Enemy don't fight in cities," Staff Sergeant William Bill Martinez said, echoing conventional wisdom about guerrilla warfare. "They hit and run, ambush and disappear. They don't occupy urban terrain and defend it. This has to be exaggeration." But the reports continued, became more detailed, painted a picture of coordinated attack that had captured most of Hue, including the Citadel. The South Vietnamese 1st Division headquarters in the Citadel was surrounded, but holding. The MACV compound south of river was under siege. All bridges across Perfume River were controlled by enemy forces. Hue had fallen to communist forces in a coordinated assault that achieved complete tactical surprise. At 700 hours, Alpha Company received orders to move to Hue, link up with besieged MACV compound, assess the situation, and report. The mission was described as reconnaissance in force, enter the city, determine enemy strength, extract American personnel if necessary. Nobody anticipated we'd be fighting through Hue for the next 26 days. We departed Fubai at 8:30 hours aboard trucks and M48 tanks, convoy rolling north on Highway 1 toward Hue. The weather was terrible. Monsoon rain reducing visibility, creating mud that made movement difficult. Monsoon season in Vietnam was miserable under the best circumstances. Continuous rain, temperatures that felt colder than the thermometer indicated, conditions that turned everything to rust and rot. Fighting in urban environment during the monsoon would compound all the usual difficulties of combat. Private First Class Michael Thompson from Ohio rode in truck next to me. 20 years old, had been in country 4 months, possessed a mixture of confidence from surviving initial combat and nervousness about urban warfare none of us had trained for. Thompson constantly checked his M16, ensuring it was loaded, safety off, ready for immediate use. "Ever fight in city before?" Thompson asked over engine noise and rain drumming on canvas top. "No," I replied honestly. "Training was in jungle and rice paddies. Urban warfare is different. Buildings provide cover but also concealment for the enemy. Can't use artillery without destroying everything. Close quarters combat where training matters less than luck." Lance Corporal Robert Rodriguez from Texas was our squad's M60 machine gunner. 23, had been with the 1st Marines since arriving in Vietnam in June 1967, participated in multiple operations along the DMZ where he'd proven himself reliable in firefights. Rodriguez treated his M60 with obsessive care that machine gunners developed after seeing what happened when weapons failed at critical moments. "Urban environment favors defenders," Rodriguez said, sharing knowledge from military history he'd studied. "Enemy can position machine guns covering streets, can move between buildings using covered routes we can't see, can create ambushes we walk into because we don't know the city layout. We're gonna take casualties taking Hue back." The convoy reached Hue's south outskirts at 10:30 hours, immediately taking fire from buildings along the highway. Not harassment fire, but sustained automatic weapons and RPG fire suggesting prepared positions with soldiers who intended to stop our advance. The lead tank was hit by RPG, damaged but mobile. Returned fire with a 90mm main gun that demolished the building where the RPG had been fired from. "Dismount, take cover," Staff Sergeant Martinez shouted, Marines jumping from trucks into ditches alongside the highway, immediately returning fire toward muzzle flashes in the buildings. The firefight lasted 30 minutes. Marines advanced systematically, fire and maneuver, using tanks for cover, clearing buildings with grenades and rifles. When we finally reached the MACV compound at 11:30 hours, Alpha Company had suffered first casualties. 2 killed, 8 wounded, learning lessons about urban combat that training hadn't taught them. The MACV compound was chaos. Approximately 200 American personnel, advisors, headquarters staff, support troops, had been defending against attacks since 0340 hours. The compound walls provided protection, but also trapped defenders who couldn't evacuate while surrounded. Dead and wounded lay in the courtyard. Medical personnel treating casualties with limited supplies. Ammunition running low after 7 hours of continuous fighting.
Major Frank Breath commanded the compound defenses, a career officer who'd never expected his administrative posting to involve sustained combat. He briefed Alpha Company Commander Captain Gordon Batchelor on tactical situation that was worse than anyone at Fubai had understood. "Enemy controls everything except this compound and small area around it," Breath said, pointing to maps that showed enemy positions throughout southern Hue. "North of river, they control entire Citadel, except ARVN 1st Division headquarters. We estimate 6,000 to 8,000 enemy soldiers in city. They're not guerrillas. These are NVA regulars, well-equipped, well-trained, defending prepared positions. This isn't going to be quick operation. Captain Batchelor radioed situation report to battalion headquarters, requesting additional forces and outlining what retaking Hue would require. The response was orders to hold MACV compound, expand perimeter if possible, await reinforcements. Alpha Company was first of multiple Marine units that would eventually commit to fighting through Hue. That afternoon, we conducted limited offensive operations south of river, attempting to expand secured area around MACV compound. Every building was fortress. Walls provided cover for defenders, windows were firing positions, rooms were kill zones where grenades and automatic fire created casualty situations impossible to avoid. We'd advance one building, encounter resistance in next building, slowly work our way forward, accepting casualties that seemed disproportionate to ground gained. Private Thompson killed his first enemy soldier that day. NVA soldier firing from second-story window. Thompson returning fire on instinct, watching soldier fall backward as rounds impacted. Afterward, Thompson sat against a wall, shaking, unable to reload his rifle for several minutes while processing what he'd done. "First time?" I asked, though answer was obvious from his reaction. "Yeah," Thompson replied. "Training doesn't prepare you for how it feels. Seeing someone die because you killed them, knowing you're going to have to do it again." By nightfall, January 31st, Alpha Company had secured area approximately 6 blocks around MACV compound. We'd suffered 8 more casualties during afternoon operations, 3 killed, 5 wounded. Enemy casualties were estimated at 40 killed based on bodies we'd seen, though actual numbers including wounded were certainly higher. That night was miserable. Monsoon rain continued. Temperature dropped. We occupied buildings that provided shelter from the weather, but not from the knowledge that enemy soldiers were in adjacent buildings, possibly preparing counterattacks. Sleep was impossible despite exhaustion. You'd doze briefly, then wake convinced you'd heard movement, seen shadows, sensed threats that may or may not have been real. The battle for Hue had begun. Part 2. House to House. February 1st through February 10th, 1968. Additional Marine units arrived in Hue. Gulf Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Entire 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, eventually over 2,500 Marines would be committed to fighting through southern Hue, clearing city block by block, building by building, room by room. The tactics evolved rapidly as Marines learned urban warfare through experience rather than training. Initial attempts to advance down streets resulted in heavy casualties from enemy machine guns positioned to cover approaches. Marines learned to move through buildings, blowing holes through walls to avoid crossing streets under fire. They learned to use tanks as mobile cover, advancing behind armor that could survive hits that killed infantry. They learned to call artillery on buildings before assaulting them, accepting destruction of the city as necessary cost of reducing casualties. The fighting was intensely personal in ways that jungle combat never was. In the jungle, the enemy was often invisible. Combat happened at ranges where you couldn't see faces. In Hue, you fought at distances measured in meters, could see enemy soldiers clearly, killed them at ranges where you smelled blood and cordite. It was brutal, exhausting, psychologically devastating in ways that created casualties beyond those officially counted. Staff Sergeant Martinez was wounded on February 3rd during assault on building near the provincial prison. He'd been leading point fire team, entering a room to clear it when NVA soldier fired from hidden position. Martinez took 3 rounds, 1 in chest stopped by body armor, 2 in abdomen that penetrated. He went down, returned fire killing the shooter, called for corpsmen while blood soaked his uniform. "Take the squad," Martinez told me, while corpsmen treated his wounds, voice carrying pain, but also clarity about what needed to happen. Keep them alive. Don't take unnecessary risks. Get them home. I inherited squad leadership for the second time in 3 days, a burden that felt heavier each time because I was watching friends die or get wounded executing my orders. Leadership in combat meant accept complete information under circumstances where mistakes meant soldiers died. Lance Corporal Rodriguez's M60 was critical to squad effectiveness. The machine gun provided suppressive fire that kept enemy heads down while riflemen maneuvered, could shoot through walls that stopped rifle fire, and created psychological effect that exceeded its physical lethality. But machine guns drew return fire. Enemy knew killing machine gunner reduced squad combat effectiveness and would target machine gun positions with RPGs and grenades whenever they could identify them. "I'm the biggest target in the squad," Rodriguez told me, while cleaning his M60 between operations. "Enemy sees me fire, they know that's a machine gun, they concentrate fire trying to knock me out. Average life expectancy for a machine gunner in urban combat is days, maybe hours. I'm on borrowed time." The casualty rate for Marines in Hue was staggering. Companies that arrived with 150 soldiers were reduced to 60 or 70 effective within days. Wounded were evacuated when possible, but sometimes medical evacuation helicopters couldn't reach casualties because landing zones were too hot. Dead were carried to collection points, eventually evacuated, but sometimes remained in the streets for days because recovering bodies under fire meant accepting additional casualties. Private Thompson developed into a reliable soldier through constant combat. The nervousness disappeared, replaced by focused competence that came from understanding what worked and what killed you. He learned to move through buildings, checking corners, learned to throw grenades before entering rooms, learned that hesitation killed you faster than aggressive action.
"I'm not the same person who arrived in Hue," Thompson said during a rare quiet moment on February 7th. "That person was kid playing soldier. Now I'm something else. Not sure what, but different. Combat changes you. Can't go back to who you were." The psychological toll was accumulating. Every Marine in Hue showed signs of combat stress, exhaustion beyond what sleep could fix, hypervigilance that made relaxation impossible, emotional numbness that made caring about anything except survival difficult. Some developed thousand-yard stares, looking through things rather than at them. Some became reckless, exposing themselves unnecessarily because they'd stopped caring about survival. Some just shut down emotionally, functioning mechanically without apparent feeling. Navy corpsmen treating casualties were overwhelmed. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Timothy O'Brien had been with Alpha Company since Fubai, had treated dozens of casualties during first week in Hue, worked continuously despite exhaustion that made hands shake. O'Brien's job was keeping wounded alive until they could reach surgical facilities, providing emergency care under fire, making triage decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. "I'm treating wounds I've never seen in training," O'Brien said, while treating Marine who'd taken RPG shrapnel to face and chest. "Massive trauma from point-blank fire, burns from explosives, injuries from building collapses. And I'm doing it all under fire, with limited supplies, knowing that half these guys won't make it even if I do everything right." The artillery and air support were both blessing and curse. When Marines encountered strong resistance, calling artillery was an effective way to reduce positions before assaulting them. But artillery in an urban environment meant destroying buildings, creating rubble that made movement difficult, killing civilians who hadn't evacuated. The same firepower that saved Marine lives was destroying the city we were supposedly liberating. On February 9th, Marine operations reached Hue University, a sprawling campus in southern part of city. The university had been converted into a fortress by NVA forces. Bunkers in courtyards, firing positions in buildings, mines and booby traps throughout the grounds. Assaulting the university required 3 days of continuous fighting, eventually was accomplished only after artillery demolished most buildings. During university assault, Rodriguez's M60 saved the squad multiple times. His suppressive fire kept enemy pinned while we maneuvered. His accurate shooting eliminated threats that would have killed riflemen. But on February 10th, While providing covering fire during assault on administration building, Rodriguez was hit by an RPG that exploded near his position. The blast threw Rodriguez backward, machine gun flying from his hands, body crumpling in a heap. I crawled to his position under fire, reached him expecting to find him dead. But Rodriguez was conscious, bleeding from shrapnel wounds in legs and abdomen, but alive. "The gun," Rodriguez said. First words were about his weapon. "Get the gun. Squad needs it." I grabbed the M60, checked that it was functional, passed it to Thompson, who took over as machine gunner. Corpsman O'Brien reached Rodriguez seconds later, began treating wounds that were serious but survivable if evacuation happened quickly. "You're going home, Rodriguez," I told him, while O'Brien worked. "The wounds are bad enough they'll send you to Japan, probably stateside after that. You're done with Hue." Rodriguez grabbed my hand, grip surprisingly strong despite blood loss. "Finish it. Take the city. Make this worth it." Rodriguez was evacuated that evening, survived his wounds, eventually recovered and returned to civilian life. Thompson inherited the M60, accepted the burden of being the squad's machine gunner with the same dedication Rodriguez had shown. By February 10th, Marines had cleared most of southern Hue. We'd advanced from MACV compound to Perfume River, secured bridges, eliminated most enemy resistance south of river. The cost had been severe. Over 150 Marines killed, 800 wounded during 10 days of continuous urban combat. But southern Hue was secured, allowing focus to shift to the citadel north of river, where the 1st ARVN Division was still besieged. Part 3. The Citadel. February 11th through February 24th, 1968. Retaking the citadel required a different approach. The ancient walls were 20 feet high and 20 feet thick, built to withstand artillery from earlier eras, but still formidable defensive positions. Inside the walls, NVA forces had fortified every building, had prepared positions for sustained defense, and had demonstrated through 2 weeks of fighting that they wouldn't retreat voluntarily. The decision to commit Marines to fighting in the citadel was controversial. South Vietnamese forces argued the citadel was their responsibility, that American forces destroying Vietnam's cultural heart would be propaganda victory for the communists. American commanders countered that ARVN forces hadn't made progress in 2 weeks, that Marines had proven effectiveness in southern Hue, that ending the battle required American involvement regardless of political sensitivities. On February 13th, Marines crossed Perfume River and entered the citadel for the first time. The 1st Battalion, 5th Marines led the assault, advancing through the gates, immediately encountering resistance that demonstrated clearing the citadel would be even more difficult than southern Hue. The fighting in the citadel combined everything that made urban warfare difficult with the additional challenges of historical preservation. Initial orders prohibited using artillery on the Imperial Palace, the cultural treasure at the citadel's center. Marines were expected to clear the citadel while minimizing damage to buildings that held centuries of history. But combat doesn't allow precision. When enemy fires from a building, you either destroy the building or accept casualties trying to assault it without preparatory fires. Alpha Company entered the citadel on February 15th, attached to the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines for operations clearing the southeastern wall. By this point, our company had been reduced to approximately 60 effective soldiers from the 140 who'd arrived in Hue 2 weeks earlier. We'd received some replacements, but not enough to offset casualties.
Private Thompson had become competent machine gunner, handling M60 with confidence that came from understanding weapons' capabilities and limitations. He learned to fire controlled bursts rather than long continuous fire, learned to position himself where he could support squad without exposing himself unnecessarily, learned that machine gunner's job was keeping squad alive rather than killing maximum enemies. Rodriguez would be proud, I told Thompson during brief respite between firefights. You're handling that M60 like veteran. Squad depends on you. You're keeping us alive. The Citadel fighting was block-by-block repetition of Southern Hue tactics. Advance, encounter resistance, call supporting fires, assault position, consolidate gains, advance to next position. Each building cost casualties. Each block took hours or days. Progress was measured in meters rather than kilometers. On February 19th, restrictions on artillery in the citadel were relaxed. The political decision was made that ending battle mattered more than preserving buildings, that casualties from fighting without artillery support exceeded acceptable levels. Artillery and airstrikes began hitting NVA positions throughout Citadel, creating devastation that destroyed much of what made Hue culturally significant, but also accelerated the battle's conclusion. The NVA forces in Citadel fought with determination that suggested political rather than purely military objectives. They'd been ordered to hold Hue, to demonstrate communist control over South Vietnam's cultural heart, to create political crisis that might force American withdrawal. Even when tactical situation became hopeless, when casualties exceeded what military doctrine said was sustainable, NVA soldiers continued defending positions because withdrawing meant admitting failure. On February 21st, Marines recaptured the flag tower at the Citadel's southeast corner, lowered NVA flag that had flown for 3 weeks, raised South Vietnamese flag in a ceremony broadcast internationally. The symbolism was clear. Hue was being retaken. Communist control was ending. American and South Vietnamese forces were prevailing despite initial defeats. But raising flag didn't mean battle was over. NVA forces continued defending the Imperial Palace and northwestern sections of the Citadel. Fighting continued for 3 more days, and casualties continued mounting on both sides. Private Thompson was wounded on February 23rd during assault on a building near the Imperial Palace. He'd been providing covering fire when NVA soldier threw a grenade that exploded near his position. Shrapnel hit Thompson in the shoulder and leg, wounds that were painful but not life-threatening. He tried continuing to fire his M60, but blood loss and shock made that impossible. "I'm sorry," Thompson said while Corman treated his wounds. "Squad needs the gun. Can't let you down." "You didn't let anyone down," I replied. "You kept us alive for 9 days carrying that M60. You earned your evacuation. Now heal up and go home." Thompson was evacuated that evening, survived his wounds, eventually recovered. I inherited the M60 myself. No one else in squad had experience to take it. On February 24th, final NVA resistance in the Citadel collapsed. The remaining defenders, perhaps 200 soldiers from the thousands who'd occupied Hue in January, withdrew during the night, crossing Perfume River, disappearing into the countryside. Marines entered Imperial Palace at dawn on February 25th, found it abandoned except for bodies and destroyed equipment. The battle for Hue was over. Part 4. The Aftermath. The cost of retaking Hue was staggering. American casualties totaled 216 killed, 1,584 wounded, the highest American casualties for any single battle to that point in the war. South Vietnamese forces suffered approximately 384 killed, 1,800 wounded. Communist casualties exceeded 5,000 confirmed killed, with total losses including wounded probably exceeding 8,000. Civilian casualties were estimated at 5,600, killed during fighting or executed by NVA forces before retreat. Hue was destroyed. Over 80% of buildings south of the river were damaged or demolished. The Citadel's ancient walls were holed by artillery and tank fire. The Imperial Palace was damaged, though not destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were homeless. Infrastructure was wrecked. Rebuilding would require years. The political impact of Hue exceeded its military significance. The battle demonstrated that the Tet Offensive hadn't been a military victory for the Communists. They'd been defeated in every major engagement, suffered catastrophic casualties, failed to spark general uprising they anticipated. But Tet also demonstrated that the war wasn't being won as American officials claimed, that the enemy could strike throughout South Vietnam, that years of American military operations hadn't prevented a major offensive. American public opinion shifted dramatically after Tet and Hue. Television coverage showed brutal urban combat, showed Marines fighting through destroyed city, showed casualties that contradicted optimistic official statements. Support for the war declined, protests intensified, political pressure mounted for American withdrawal. For the Marines who fought in Hue, political debates seemed irrelevant. We'd done our jobs, had retaken the city despite casualties, had proven American forces could defeat the enemy in sustained urban combat. Whether retaking Hue mattered strategically, whether destroying the city to save it made sense, whether American involvement in Vietnam was justified, these were questions for others to answer. I survived Hue and 3 more months in Vietnam. Made it home in May 1968 to America convulsed by political turmoil, where Hue was controversial rather than celebrated, where Marines who'd fought there were ignored or criticized rather than honored. The urban warfare lessons from Hue influenced American military doctrine. The battle demonstrated the importance of training for urban operations, the need for combined arms coordination, the value of firepower in reducing casualties. But the lessons also included an understanding of urban combat's psychological toll, a recognition that destroying cities to save them created political problems that exceeded military victories.
The massacre of civilians in Hue became controversial. During their occupation, NVA forces executed approximately 2,800 civilians, government officials, intellectuals, anyone suspected of opposing communism. Bodies were found in mass graves after battle ended, evidence of systematic killings that constituted war crimes. But Western media coverage focused more on destruction caused by American firepower than on communist executions, creating a narrative that Marines were destroying rather than liberating Hue. The sounds still trigger memories. Thunder sounds like artillery. Rain reminds me of monsoon that turned Hue's streets to mud. Smell of smoke returns me to burning buildings. Urban environments create anxiety that never completely fades. But I survived, and survival means obligation, to remember brothers who didn't survive, to tell stories of Marines who fought through 26 days of urban hell, to ensure that Hue isn't forgotten despite political controversies. This was Hue, the ancient imperial city that became modern battlefield, where cultural treasures were destroyed to prevent communist victory, where Marines proved they could fight in urban environment despite training that prepared them for jungle. This is their story.